Hello and welcome to another edition of the Chad's Chatterings podcast. I am your host, Chad Maples, and this is the June 1st, 2022 edition of the podcast. I'm very specific with that date because this month we're doing two podcasts. I normally do one podcast a month. This month I'm trying to do two of them. So if you can come back, I'm glad you're here today, but if you come back on June 15th, we will have another podcast ready for you this month. Two for the price of one, so to speak. So, glad you're here. Thank you for everybody who tuned in last week for our first time on YouTube. Thanks for all those who subscribed to the channel. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe to the podcast if you're listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you're listening to. We're glad that you're here, whether you're watching it on a video or listening to the audio version. We are glad that you are here. Today's podcast is entitled Checklist Christianity. I had the opportunity to take flying lessons about this time last year, and one thing that I learned is that pilots have a lot of checklists to follow. In addition to having checklists, there's hundreds of acronyms that you can learn that can help you kind of learn what to do in certain situations. It makes it easier to learn things along the way. But in addition to these multiple checklists and the hundreds of acronyms that you learn along the way, outside of all of this, flying the airplane requires that you are multitasks and that you learn how to multitask with several different things and pay attention to where you are, and there's several factors involved. And I was reminded of this on one particular day as I was getting ready to make a landing at the Augusta, Kansas airport. And we had just entered a traffic pattern, and I was parallel with the landing site, and we were about at 80 knots, which is the speed that we wanted to be at, about 2,200 feet. I went through my checklist. I put the carburetor heat on. I had everything ready to go. I checked everything. And then at that moment, I lowered the flaps by 10 degrees, which is what I was supposed to do. But then shortly after I lowered the flaps by 10 degrees, we had an unfavorable drop in altitude. Thankfully, my flight instructor was there. He pushed the throttle in and we were able to recover. We finished the landing procedure, and then when we got back inside, I asked my flight instructor, what did I do wrong at the beginning of that landing procedure, and why did we have that sudden loss in altitude? And he explained to me that we had what was called a wing stall. Now, in order for a plane to fly properly, the wind has to go above and below both of the wings. And so when you lower the flaps by 10 degrees, the plane has a tendency to pull upwards or balloon upwards, and as a result, the wind can be cut off from going over the wing, and that it results in a sudden loss of altitude. So sometimes you have a what's called a stall warning. Sometimes you don't have a warning, and we didn't have a warning under those circumstances. But what I saw happened was I forgot how to do a simple procedure that I knew all along. I was so focused on the checklist that I forgot that one simple procedure that was so important. But when I needed to remember it the most, that's when I forgot. When I was in ground school, my instructor asked the class, what is the first thing that you do when you lose an engine? And several people had several suggestions of what to do and what checklists to follow and what acronyms to refer to. And the instructor says, no, none of that is important. The main thing, the main focus is to fly the plane. You fly the plane, you maintain control, you realize, you make sure you know where you are first, and then you go to the checklist. Checklists are nice because they help us to stay focused, and they give us a feeling of progress along the way. But they don't work with everything in life. Imagine if your spouse or loved one followed a checklist when it came to your relationship. When your husband or wife leaves the house in the morning and you kiss them goodbye as they go off to work, in your mind you don't have a checklist that, hey, I got 4 more to go. You can't run a relationship based on a checklist because it takes out the feelings and emotions, and you're just going through the motions, and you're not focused on what's really important. And if you follow a checklist in a relationship, it really doesn't work that well because you're just going through a routine. And a checklist does not work in our relationship with God either. But unfortunately, there are so many people that feel like they need to follow a checklist when it comes to grading their Christianity. They say, well, we went to church, we pray, check. We go to church, check. We give to the church, check. We were in a small group, check. And then the list goes on and on. And a checklist for Christianity without a change of heart is nothing more than putting a facelift on a corpse. We put ourselves in a dangerous situation when we start following this checklist Christianity mentality. Because if we are serving God through a checklist, it takes out the feelings of thankfulness and the emotions of gratitude and the joy that comes from serving others. Whenever this happens, Christians in general forget how to, quote, fly the plane. They forget all about Christian living or what Christian living is all about. They forget about being lights to the world, and then they try to get by with as little as possible. The children of Israel in the Old Testament tried to do this with God by living lives of hypocrisy while doing religious ceremonies and sacrifices along the way. God addressed this in Amos chapter 5, starting at verse 21. He said to them, I hate and I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs, I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a never failing stream. God rejected their religious ceremonies because of their hypocrisy. They were trying to appease God through worship while continuing to live sinful lives. Paul would later put it this way in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 3, when he said, And though I bestow all of my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. To explain this further, we need to understand that faith is more important than religion. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's define our terms. Religion, and this is the textbook dictionary definition of these terms, religion is a personal set or institutionalized system of religious beliefs, attitudes, or practices. And then faith is an allegiance to a duty or a person or something that is believed, especially with a strong conviction. Now, some people view religion as a structure of rules and boundaries and cans and cannots. And some even see the religious leaders or leaders in some religious organizations as those who regulate good and evil and that can determine whether we're on one side or the other. And it is this mindset that has caused so many people to leave their religious organization and go somewhere else. Now, notice that I said they left their religious organization, but they didn't necessarily leave their faith, because faith is the universal component that all religions have in common. Faith is the driving force that motivates us to become better versions of ourselves. When life gets tough, it is faith and not religion that reassures us that things will eventually get better. We clearly saw this during the 2020 COVID pandemic when our places of public assembly and worship were closed. We could not physically assemble somewhere, and we were forced to have online church or watch services online within the comfort of our own homes. Perfect attendance on Sundays for many people was ruined. For most of us, it was ruined. And we had to sit at home and watch services online. We were pulled away from the so called structure of religion and called to rely more on our faith in what we really believed to be our foundation. And it is your faith and not religion that creates happiness. At the end of the day, people are going to be remembered by their actions and not necessarily by their religious ceremonies. A person is going to be remembered by the values and contributions that they made to society and not necessarily how many times they were in church or how many times they performed a particular religious ceremony. Now, I'm not trying to minimize church attendance. I'm not trying to minimize any kind of worship ceremony at all. But the problem is when we place these things as a higher priority to Christian living, that is when we find ourselves to be in serious trouble because we have forgotten our purpose. There are several places of worship that struggled during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. There are some places of worship that unfortunately had to close their doors due to the lack of support. Some of them closed them permanently and they were never able to reopen. A lot of places struggled and lost several of its members. Now, to illustrate this, I want to talk about something that happened here in the city of Wichita during the pandemic. Now, I'm going to use 3 different religious organizations or places of worship that I observed. And instead of calling these places by names, I've just referred to them as Church A, Church B, and Church C. Now, churches A, B, and C, they have very similar beliefs, but they have very distinct differences as well. Some people would refer to these as different denominations, but again, we'll refer to them as A, B, and C. Prior to the pandemic, Church A seemed pretty strong, and it saw some of its members begin to leave and go elsewhere, but it was holding pretty stable. But when COVID hit and it forced churches A, B, and C to shut down, Church A was affected the most in the most negative way. They were not initially set up for online services and they quickly had to buy equipment and learn how to do things online. Churches B and C already had online services in place and they continued to broadcast their services and broadcast sermons online, and they encourage people to tune in online or to keep up with them by email or etc. Whatever method of communication they chose to use. Now, over time, churches B and C were able to make the proper requirements or the proper arrangements according to the CDC requirements to open up and have people assemble again publicly. Church A, however, delayed their decision to make those arrangements and continued to do things online. And as a result, people from Church A started attending churches B and C when they opened up their doors to the general public. Overall, Church A wound up losing about 75% of its original members to churches B and C because of things that had happened during the pandemic. Now, depending on who you ask, some people would say that the people who left Church A had left their faith because of churches B and C. However, the people who left Church A did not leave their faith because they still had faith. They just simply left a religious organization and attended somewhere else. One author put it this way: faith is a mindset, and religion is an organization. Faith is self motivation, and religion is the abidance of the rules. Faith is understanding imperfection, and religion is a lifelong strive for perfection. Faith is free, religion costs time, money, and sometimes freedom. Faith is what unites people for a better tomorrow, while religion categorizes ideas to prevent unification. Faith is about having a relationship that is motivated by love. Faith without works is useless and dead. Many people try to put faith and works on a scale of balance and see which one will weigh more than the other. And the fact of the matter is that it is not a popularity contest. It's about having a faith that works. It's about having a loving relationship with your Creator that motivates you to love others regardless of their backgrounds and regardless of their differences. Again, as a result of the pandemic, some people developed what I like to call a COVID coma. They became comfortable just staying at home and watching services online, even though they were meeting publicly. They just didn't want to get out in public. They didn't want to be around others, and they relied more on their faith than their works, and they wanted to get by with as little as possible. It kind of reminds me of a lady who visited a local church here in town and talked to one of the preachers there, and she wanted to make sure that this place of worship or this church was not a work-based church. And so she pulled the preacher to the side and she said, if I become a member here, or if I start attending here, I don't have to be here every Sunday in order for God to accept me and for the people here to like me. And the preacher says, well, no, you don't have to. And she said, and I don't have to be involved with the children's ministry. She picked that out specifically because she had kids at home. And he says, no, you don't have to. And then she says, and I don't have to be involved in one of these small groups that you have. And he says, well, you don't have to, but maybe you should. And then finally she said, and I don't have to share my faith with anybody, and God will be completely satisfied with who I am. The conversation at this point kind of was uncomfortable for the preacher, as you can imagine. The fact of the matter is that we are supposed to be lights to the world. We're not to be conformed by this world, but transformed by the renewing of our mind. Someone once said that you can be an atheist and be a really nice person, or you can be a Christian and a really horrible person. If you look at Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9, it says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, and not of works, lest any man should boast. Many of us like to stop at verse 9 and we say, well, yep, there it says right there, it is by works, not that anybody should boast. But then we fail to read the very next verse, in verse 10, where it says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God has prepared for them that walk in him. And so it is very important that we realize that it is our faith that is going to carry us through difficult times. But when Jesus came to the end of his life, and when Jesus took his last breath, his last 3 words were, it is finished. The ultimate sacrifice for our sins was made, and only Jesus, after he lived a perfect and sinless life, said those words, it is finished. So the question remains, are you living like it is finished. Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he made the plan of salvation very simple in Mark 16:16. He said that he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, and he that does not believe will be condemned. Many of you have believed the gospel message and have been baptized and according to what Jesus had said in Mark 16:16. And in Acts chapter 2, we see an example of this unfold as 3,000 people on the day of Pentecost were baptized, and the Lord added people to his church, such as should be saved. Considering everything that the Lord has done for us, how can we not have faith to be motivated to do work and to do good works for him? Living the Christian life and having a faith that works takes discipline. Coach Nick Saban was talking to a group of students who were attending a football camp at the University of Alabama a few years ago. And he said there were 3 things that he told all of his players throughout his coaching career. He said, the first thing I tell them is that they need to give effort and have the proper mindset. He said, the second thing I tell them is that they need to have mental toughness, because life is difficult, but you're going to have to overcome adversity in order to be successful in life. And then the third thing he said is to be responsible and be able to do your job. And if you don't have discipline, you're going to be disappointed. He then wrapped up his thoughts by saying, your thoughts, your habits, and your priorities will make you who you are. When we look at ourselves and we look at our Christian walk, we need to examine our thoughts and our habits and our priorities to make sure that we have them in the right place. We need to make sure that we have the proper discipline so that we can make the right decision at the right time when we know we're supposed to do that. And when we are supposed to do something or not to do something, it requires discipline, because if we are not disciplined, then we are always going to be disappointed. If we're not disciplined, then we're going to do the things that we should not do. And at the end of Jesus' life, after everything that he went through, after the beating, after the scourgings, after wearing the crown of thorns, after being nailed to the cross for several hours, he finally took that final breath and he said, it is finished. But the question remains, are you living like it is finished? This concludes this particular episode of the Chaz Chatterings podcast. Thank you once again for tuning in. Make sure you like, follow, or subscribe to the podcast so you can know when new episodes are available. And thanks for tuning in once again, and we'll see you next time.